All right, for this video, I want to discuss the term gun violence. Now, gun violence is a pretty significant term in the gun control debate, um, as evidenced by its use in the title of the main gun control organization in the United States, the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. And it's significant because it demonstrates the uh, logic and the techniques used by the gun control movement. Um, it's a very subtle semantic device that they use uh, to sway people. And the main thing about the term is that when they use that term, people imagine, homicides, they imagine little children getting killed. They don't typically imagine, cancer patients shooting themselves. But the majority of the gun deaths in the United States, anywhere between 55 and 65% of all gun deaths, are actually suicides. And most people, when they view guns as a social issue, do not think of the use of guns and suicide as warranting any kind of gun control. Because even though people may not like suicide, they tend not to think that it's something that's so evil that they should ban guns over it. However, that is where you get all these big numbers. It's real common. I forget how many, but you'll see claims 35,000 Americans die every year from gun violence. No, I don't. The reason they say gun violence is because they could plausibly include suicide in that number. And this is a pretty important distinction because every time I brought this up to a gun control proponent, I tell them that the majority, perhaps even a decent sized majority of the gun deaths in the United States are suicides, not any kind of homicide. They tend not to believe me, and I've even been told that that's just an NRA lie of some type. And I think the reason that this is because it robs the large death toll of much of its meaning. Um, and the fact is that you know it's a very useful way to inflate the numbers. When they say 30,000, 35,000 people die, they do everything they can to imply that it's, innocent little girls or whatever, when in fact it's not. And uh, they make a lot of, and the thing is violence, it's very hard to really, when you think about it, um, decry unviolence as opposed to other forms of violence. A murder that's committed with a knife or a car or a bat, it's very hard to argue that that's somehow less bad or more desirable than a murder that's committed with a gun. And by distinguishing only firearm violence, um, they can exaggerate the problem. So they can say, "Oh, the United States has, a huge social problem with gun violence." When, if you just consider homicide rates in general or suicide rates in general, uh, the disparity where it exists, which it doesn't always, uh, is a lot less dramatic. This is especially true with suicides. There are many countries that have much, much higher suicide rates than the United States. Japan comes to mind. I think it has about quadruple the suicide rate. But it has almost no gun suicide because guns are basically illegal in Japan, and so they have knife suicide. Uh, and I don't know if anyone could say, well, Japan doesn't have a suicide problem, but the United States does, because the fact that they kill themselves with knives in Japan means it's not a big deal, whereas in the United States, when people kill themselves with guns, that's way worse. And it's just interesting. I don't know if anybody can logically defend the position that a, a an instance of gun violence is in any way more morally objectionable, objectable, objectionable than uh, violence that occurs from non-gun uses. And I saw this recently. Uh, I read in a article in the UK that about Switzerland. That yes, it's true. Switzerland has a lot of gun ownership and does not have high crime, but it does have very high gun suicide rate. Uh, as if another suicide rate that might even be higher, but not involving guns, would be okay or not as bad. And indeed, there are many countries in Europe that have effective gun bans that have much higher suicide rates, like Slovenia, Poland. Some of the Nordic countries, although they do not have gun bans like much of the rest of Europe, they have fairly lenient gun laws and they do have high suicide rates. Uh, there's no evidence that banning guns reduces the rate of suicide. There is a lot of evidence that banning guns reduces the use of guns in suicide. But most people who are going to commit suicide will just do so by other means. Guns are the preferred method of suicide, at least among males, whenever they're available. And so, by framing the issue as one of gun violence, it is plausible to say that a gun ban will reduce gun violence, but only because it will reduce gun suicide. Now, it won't reduce total suicide. The suicide rate will likely stay the same. It may even go up, may go down slightly. Correlation is very weak. But without that, the effects of gun control are much less. That's the one area where gun control will reduce deaths by guns. And so it makes sense for them to claim that they're against gun violence. But the evidence that it reduces homicide rates in general, there really isn't any. I'm going to make another video addressing international comparisons, so I don't want to get too much into that here, but um, there is a lot of gun violence, but distinguishing gun violence from other violence, I think, is kind of silly. Um, if the number of knife murders increases and makes up the difference in the number of guns used in shootings, I don't see how you could argue that there's a net gain there, and yet that's the argument you would have to make if you want to justify a gun ban, because that's the only effect that might have in crime. It can reduce the rate that guns are used in crime, but not necessarily the crime rate itself. The crime rate either doesn't change or it may even go up slightly. I'm not saying that's a causal relationship, but just that the evidence that it causes gun overall violence to go down is very dubious. So whenever you hear these huge numbers, always ask, well, how many of those are suicides? How many of them are police killings? The police kill not an insignificant number of people every year. And also a number of people are killed every year in justifiable homicides. It's not super common. Mostly defensive gun use does not involve killing an assailant. But when it does, that counts as gun violence usually. uh, and that's dubious as well. So anyway, I just think that it's important. I mean, it's the main semantic trick of gun control proponents. And I think that most of them, since they're not typically well versed in the facts, are simply not aware what percentage are suicides. Um, and I mean, when I've debated them in the past, it must be an important topic because they often refuse to even acknowledge that it's true, and they figure that you're making that up. That's the Center of Disease Control, or perhaps the FBI. I don't think women use guns to commit suicide so much, but among men, that's the way to go. So, all right. Well, I think that's it for this one.